Good morning. Welcome to the virtual National Hurricane Conference and the Pet and Animal Sheltering Capacity Workshop. We've got a number of people. I was telling everybody that when we were at the National Hurricane Conference, when we started the 10:30 workshop, normally from 10 to 10:30, there's a coffee break. And we would start, there would be a number of people sitting there, but then we would, we'd have to wait for everybody to finish their coffee or decide which workshop they wanted to go to next. But in this case, we're the only workshop, so we should be able to get going. Yep. So I can, got it. Now I had to figure out how to advance the slides here. All right. My name is Michael Whitehead. I'm with the American Red Cross. I'm also the Vice Chair of the National VOAD, the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster Mass Care Committee. And I was also ended up being the chairperson of the Pets and Sheltering Subcommittee of the one. That's a lot of titles. But I had all the titles, but I didn't have a lot of the knowledge and everything. So we had a lot of people who came in and helped us out in putting together this information, which I'm going to talk about how we arrived at that. I'm the moderator. We're going to have two speakers, Diane Robinson with the Humane Society of the United States and Josh Cary with the National Animal Rescue and Sheltering Coalition. I'll let them go through their ample and impressive resumes when they get ready to talk. A little bit about the National VOAD, Voluntary Organizations Acting in Disaster. We basically provide a forum for the 4 C's, which is cooperation, communication, coordination, collaboration, and this helps us all be more effective in responding to disasters when we do that. The National VOAD is over 65 national organization members. There's a variety of faith-based, community, other non-governmentals. We've got a state VOAD and territory VOADs, over 55 of those, and they're also they represent the local and the regional VOADs and all of throughout the country. And we have partner agencies and corporations, foundations, government, and things like that. The National VOAD Mass Care Committee, we have the VOAD has a number of committees. The Mass Care Committee is one. It's basically the leading voluntary agencies in mass care, which is shelter, feeding, distribution of emergency supplies, and other related services during a disaster. The purpose of the committee is to look where we can jointly work and plan together to help communicate, coordinate, cooperate, and collaborate. And that's kind of what we did on this pet sheltering project. The Pet and Shelters project came up last May when we were at the National VOAD conference. We were all there. And remember those old days back when we used to go to conferences and get together? And yeah, that seems like a long time ago. Well, one of the issues that came up in the conference last year was really in response to the terrible events of the fire in California, and there was an enormous tragedy, but also there was a lot of issues not only with the sheltering of the individuals but with the sheltering of pets. So we decided there was a lot of consensus within the committee at that time that we need to look at defining the pet sheltering capability. And so we put together a subcommittee, and we went out and rounded up some really good subject matter experts from around the country. And here's some of the subcommittee members that we got. And it was my job. I was the one that knew really the least about the topic. My knowledge of pet sheltering extends to the 2 dogs that are right now asleep at my feet. And I know how to take care of them, but when it comes to taking care of 100 animals in a shelter, there's a lot more logistics and expertise that's involved. So we had I was very pleased and able to get a lot of information and from the different subcommittee, and we produced a document which Diane and Josh are going to talk about here. So I'm going to bring up here the National Mass Care Strategy website, because once we get the document approved by the National VOAD Board, we're going to publicize it on the National VOAD website as well as the National Mass Care Strategy website. And it's an important website where right now we're already getting mass care information for the national mass care community, and we're posting it on this website. There's sheltering and feeding information that's on the website, so I recommend you go and look at it. We'll come back to that here presently. We are going to have questions, and what you need to do is on your the software, the GoToWebinar on there, you can enter in your questions, and at the end of the Diane and Josh's presentation, hopefully they will answer most of your questions, but if you have additional questions, you enter in them, and I will read off the questions, and hopefully that Josh and Diane will be able to give an answer for that. So having said that, let me toss it over to Diane.
So good morning. My name is Diane Robinson. I am the program manager for disaster services with the Humane Society of the United States. Recently, we have an international branch, Humane Society International, and recently we have merged those departments to be the Global Animal Rescue and Response, also known as the Global Animal Rescue Team. So the next slide, please. So just briefly about our organization, we are a member of NVOAD. We have an animal rescue team that does both assisting with cruelty work, so helping agencies if they are over capacity to handle any kind of cruelty, so hoarding, puppy mills, dog fighting, those kind of things. We also do a lot of training as far as our law enforcement and cruelty division that goes out and helps train communities with how to respond, how to recognize, and resources for those kind of cruelty cases. And then working with emergency management and communities for the natural disaster side of things, or the human-made disasters that fall outside of the realm of the cruelty cases. Next slide, please. We work with partner groups around the country, sheltering groups, so that we can help with transport of animals, particularly during disaster. That's one of the capacities that we have filled when agencies don't have a way to get their animals out of harm's way when a hurricane is coming in. If we can go in and remove those animals, owned by the shelters, if we can remove those animals from those shelters and get them to partners where they can be adopted out, and relieving the stress on those agencies that are going to be responding to the disaster after the storms come in. So we have 4 branches within our organization: the operations, which oversees all of our equipment, our supplies. They run the shelters, the animal shelters, if we are for the hoarding cases and those kind of cruelty cases. We also have an animal crimes that helps people get the information about animal crimes to the agency, the jurisdiction that is responsible for that. And then finally, the disaster side, which is where I'm at. So that is helping organizations prepare for disasters, developing their disaster plans, training them in how that they can run shelters and how to run their operations, and then our volunteer crew that assists with responses when we go in. Sorry, words are hard sometimes. Michael, next slide, please. All right, so just quickly, some of the things that the national organizations that respond to disaster we refer to as a human-made disaster. Certainly cruelty falls into that, but other areas of human-made disaster, you look at the oil spills, wildfires are in there for those that are started by human capacity, although those are a natural disaster that they take over when they are obviously burning down the forest. And then the other things from the natural disaster side that we've been working on, or that we work on, are, you know, beyond the hurricanes, are tornadoes, floods, and most recently the pandemic, with trying to support communities getting food sent around. One of the things in this current pandemic that Josh and I will be talking about as part of the sheltering is looking at how we can respond to disaster safely, and how these sheltering operations can work in trying to stay within the requirements for social distancing and safety. So next slide. So finally, with this, I'm sure many of you are aware of this, the preparedness, looking at the 4 phases of response of disaster with prevention, mitigation, preparedness, the response and recovery. This document that we're going to talk about is a lot at looking at that preparedness piece of it, so that agencies know what they're going to need, hopefully building up supplies prior to a disaster, so that they have those available. It's also then, we'll talk about that in the response, it's not just like, this is a document for you to understand some of these resources, both human and the physical resources with the cages and such, but that there's a lot more to it that Josh and I will talk about, that it's running the shelters. That aspect of it is much more complicated, and this document isn't going to necessarily fully prepare you to operate a shelter, but it certainly is great information as far as what you're going to need just for setup and that. So next slide.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Josh Cary, here representing NARS, for the National Animal Rescue and Sheltering Coalition. Very honored to be a part of this panel and to speak on all the work that the subject matter experts put together for this. NARS, well, real quick, my background is with one of the agencies of NARS, of American Humane. I actually have a background in human search and rescue, but over the last 10 years have gotten the animal component, working with experts like Diane and many of the others that were part of this document, not only for the sheltering piece of it, but field rescue for animals as well. So you'll see that Diane and my background match pretty similar. I actually used to work with Diane, so I have that the great experience of having her as a mentor on much of this information throughout this presentation. Next slide. So real quick, to identify who NARSC is, very similar to NVOAD. NARSC is, or National Animal Rescue and Sheltering Coalition, is made up of the national animal welfare agencies that are basically active in disasters as well. So you'll see a wide variety in the logos on the slide in front of you. Some of the agencies are field responders and shelter responders. Some of the agencies are support. Some of them, like Red Cross, don't necessarily do the animal piece, but obviously are very active in disasters, and we want to be a partner and understand what they're doing on the human side and then we can explain what we're doing on the animal side as well. So there's a pretty good cross of the agencies that are involved. We have agencies that are granting agencies that help support the community with funding. So PetSmart Charities, Pet Finder Foundation, to name a couple. And then we've got some on the human search and rescue side as well on SUSAR. So we really do want to have that scope of what's going on in a disaster and be able to communicate with the different agencies. Next slide, please. So NARS was formed after the horrible summer of 2005. Unfortunately, those agencies I showed you previously, as well as many other agencies that responded to Katrina, operated in silos. We worked within our agency and only within our agency, and that caused a lot of problems. And we reflected on that and said we can do a better job if we come together to solve some of these issues, especially in disasters. So you might notice on those slides that some of these agencies might be considered competitors in certain donation sense. But in the disaster realm, we have to come together to be able to solve these, whether actually working during the disaster together or trying to solve the problems in peace times, if you will, to come up with solutions that'll enable us to better solve the problems when disasters happen, much like this document. So our mission is to identify those problems that affect both people and animals caused by disasters and figure out those solutions. Right now we've got 14 members. We continue to add members. We just asked that the agencies are national in scope, and then we'll go through some of the criteria or what makes up NARS membership. Next slide, please. So for NARS agencies, one of the things that enable us to work together, as I mentioned before, we got a lot of agencies that you might consider competing. We kind of set up a list of guidelines that help us work together. So we've got a code of conduct that we agree to operate in, both during response and non-response, basically respecting other agencies' anonymity, as well as not self-deploying. That's a big one that anytime you get into the disaster realm, you need to respect the local agency and be requested to come in. And that applies even for us at the national level. We don't just go in to any community when there's a disaster. We work with the local agencies to get that official request coming in. We consistently have regular meetings. We actually just had a half-day virtual meeting yesterday, trying to take care of some NARS business, communicating throughout the disaster, trying to coordinate resources to minimize duplication and try to find those gaps and see where we can help out those communities. Best practice working groups of trying to get this information out to folks, much like this document as well, that we're going to present. Liaisons or subject matter experts to local, state, and federal agencies to look at the animal issues that they may or may not be aware of. And then talk about training and exercise to not only internally for the organizations, but to also push that out to local agencies to help build their capability. Working with federal planning partners. You saw that on the list of people who are part of this document. That's very consistent with the work we do across the board. Making sure that we do integrate into emergency management that goes in with not self-deploying, of working with those local authorities. And then we want to share our lessons learned. Hopefully a local agency doesn't experience a disaster and aren't very familiar with some of this. So we want to share the experience that we get out in the field with those agencies to help shorten their learning curve of what some of the hiccups that we run across, even time and time again, doing this a lot, or one-offs where a new situation came up, and we want to share that. Next slide. So real quick on the best practice working group, it was a partnership between USDA and NASEP. that kind of brought it together as NARS was co-chairing on these different committees, but you'll see the scope of these different groups that covers a wide variety within the disaster realm. Emergency animal decontamination, animal evac and transportation, emergency animal sheltering, disaster veterinary care, preparedness and community outreach, planning, resource management, zoological, and animal search and rescue. So that's a wide scope. And then we continue to update that. This sheltering supplies or resource document doesn't belong specifically to us, but it's very similar to the information and the way we like to bring information together and then get it out to the masses. Next slide, please.
So one of the things that it's important to remember is that disaster is a local problem and it requires a local response. And what I mean by that is that that's the first, certainly, community that's impacted. That's the jurisdiction that's responsible. And like Josh said, we don't want folks going in, well-intended perhaps, but racing in to try and solve the problem without being invited in and being part of that overall picture of the solution. So a lot of people, we're programmed that you dial 911 and help's going to arrive at your door. That is not the intention behind FEMA, nor is it the intention behind the NGOs that are assisting with disaster. When a local jurisdiction has their needs are exceeded, then that's when we are called in and we assist with those. So the big part of the community is being prepared to be able to respond to the disaster on their own, because initially they're going to be the first line of defense in that and helping their communities. And so we want them to understand what they're going to need to be able to do in order to start the process of the response. Next slide. And one of the things that from the animal side, talking about the human animal bond, and through the years, this has certainly gotten a lot more obvious. We saw a lot in the summer of 2005 with the Katrina, Rita, Wilma, where folks were just, the animal plans weren't there. So there wasn't anything taking care of that. And this human animal bond is strong. People are going to go to extreme lengths to take care of their pets. They're going to want to evacuate with them. If they can't evacuate with them, then oftentimes they're going to stay. Or in cases in this photo where you see people aren't even going to come into the shelter if they can't be with their pets. We've seen this repeatedly in all conditions. Wildfires in Colorado, as Josh said, we started out in search and rescue together and then American Humane together. And so working wildfires out in Colorado, extreme heat, and people who were going to stay in their cars with their pets because they were going to be separated in the shelter.
Yeah, and if you ever get a chance, to talk with any law enforcement that's posted at roadblocks, many of them have stories of people who try to get in to go in to get their animals, but can't because of safety issues. They'll drive down the road just out of sight or just far enough away, park their cars, and then walk into the area, which creates a huge risk. But they're doing it to try to get in after their animals. So that same energy, or care, follows them once they get their animals, or if their animals already out, to provide that care and shelter for them, just like they need it for themselves and their family.
And that's one of the things that we talk to emergency managers about, and the jurisdictional leads for animals in disaster. Early on, I can remember talking to emergency managers and they're like, I don't care about animals, I care about people. And my response was always, well, if you care about people, then you need to care about animals, because they're going to go hand in hand. And if for no other reason, if there isn't provisions for the animals in disaster, you are going to get destroyed by the media. If nothing else, I mean, you look at the human risk of responders having to go in and try and save these people who didn't evacuate or who have snuck behind the fire line. But if for no other reason to care about them, then care about them because the people are going to cry out if you don't. And we're seeing that voices can be strong when they get committed to a cause. So next slide. So a little bit here, Josh and I will talk a little bit about some background and history in disaster response. This was actually my first disaster. So I came in after the big influx of response in Katrina. And I was actually watching the Weather Channel or CNN or something in 2007. And they were interviewing the veterinarian for this particular vet clinic. And this was the community that had asked American Humane to come in. We were watching this and the vet was going, yeah, we'll be fine. We've, put sandbags up. We're always fine. The river was down the road a ways. And as he was live on camera, this was being breached. So the initial responses to disaster early on, and next slide, Michael, were not there yet, particularly from the animal side. So even in 2005, the Pets Act came into being and, trying to motivate communities to plan for disaster. It wasn't there and consistently. So this was the shelter that when we arrived on scene that we started to set up for this Miami, Oklahoma flooding. This is July. It's in Oklahoma. There had just been massive flooding. There was an oil refinery upriver that had been had contaminants in the water among all the other contaminants in the water. And we were setting up in a parking lot outside of the Humane Society, which was about a room and a half size building, shed really, where they ran their animal shelter. So from this site, we were then able to find an animal shelter. We were able to find a facility that we could set up a better operation. But it's progressed. And as the collaboration that Josh talks about with the best practice working groups, trying to get the animal response folks to a higher level of training and expertise, this is where it started.
And real quick, I mean, any agency that doesn't have a plan, even though these pictures were taken back in 2007, if you don't have a plan, this is probably what's going to happen, not having some of this stuff figured out ahead of time. And as Di mentioned, in the conditions of this particular environment in the summer and the heat, aside from all the biosecurity and all the other issues that are raised up on this, you can see giant safety concerns, not only for the animals, which were there to provide that shelter and care for, but for our responders and volunteers as well. You're looking at heat stress, heat stroke for us as well. So that's just bad things are going to happen in an environment like this when reaction is what all you have and you don't have a plan to work with.
Next slide. So one of the things that's changed, and we're continuing to work on, and is my mission with HSUS, is to improve the planning and the training for disasters. So getting out into communities and helping them go through their current plans, if they have one, to look at what kind of mitigation they need to do for the disasters that they're exposed to, and then preparing them to be able to respond to it. This is the agencies, so humane societies, animal control facilities, but we also want to get into with the emergency managers and the community animal response teams and those folks who are going to be taking the lead. Couple functions with that is by doing trainings, obviously you're getting more prepared. The people are familiar with what that plan is, but it's also that collaboration. Sure, you'll be shocked to know that animal welfare groups don't always play well in the sandbox. And so we want them to be able to depend on each other and count on each other. And I learned this early on in disaster. If I'm doing, we're involved in a rope rescue, I want to know that Josh on the other end of my rope knows what he's doing, that he's set the safeties, that he's done all of that work ahead of time to make sure that my part of that mission is safe. And I don't want to have to think about that, and I don't want to have to double check what he's doing. I want to know going into it that he's trained, he's safe, and he's going to keep me safe, because our number one goal is that in the work that we're doing is to not make ourselves a victim of the response in trying to save the animals and help the community. We need to first keep ourselves safe and protect ourselves.
Yeah,
Josh,
the training piece is huge. Training and exercise to get communities to exercise or go through their plan to actually test it, and then get folks familiar with it, as well as the partner agencies they'd be working with, for the very reasons that Diane just mentioned, of being able to rely on them, knowing that those pieces are covered, and folks know or understand the responsibilities that the different agencies have. There's a break, or there's sometimes there's separation within agencies between animal control, the folks that go out in the field to rescue the animals, and the sheltering agencies. And some of those agencies can be governmental agencies or non-governmental agencies, but they all need to work together in a disaster to make sure that those pieces are covered, and that the resources are there and provided for those animals.
so we're going to jump to the next slide now, which is going to be starting in on this document. It's a fabulous document, and it sets up some of these resources and that for that initial phase in planning. So, Josh.
Yeah, so I'd like you to kind of take a look at that picture too, because this is quite an operation that's set up. And it kind of lends to the fact that, you know, a larger operation, there's going to be a lot of moving pieces, and it takes quite a bit to set it up, not just supply wise, but personnel and experience to do it, as well as the location to be able to house that in. So there's a lot going on in there, but you can see how clean and the flow and function of this operation just kind of speaks to the, you know, the effort that was put forward in planning for the layout, as well as having the equipment of personnel and supplies available to be able to set an operation like that up. When we talk about resources, you'll hear it a couple times. Resources becomes a catch-all phrase, but it really means the people, the personnel, the supplies, the location. It's pretty much what's needed for an operation to happen. So we'll just kind of build off of that. Next slide, please. So scope and application, obviously we want to, you know, try to make a document that can help folks better understand of what is required or it takes to set up a shelter. There's a lot of pieces that go into it, much like on the human side of a shelter. You really want people that have the knowledge and background of working with human issues that are causing disasters, including health issues, stress issues, mental health. On the animal side, there's a lot of that goes into. So we wanted to kind of build a document to kind of show what some of those resources are, a pretty good list of those resources, and then have local agencies kind of see what they have within their community to be able to build that local capacity. We want to also, you know, with those resources, part of those resources is the partnership of finding people. And as mentioned, you know, there's the national VOAD, but there's local VOADs too. They may not be animal centric, but they might want to help out the overall mission, including animals, to be able to educate those local groups to be able to understand what their role could be within a shelter. They may not be the leading managing piece of it, but they can help bring in supplies or help run the facility or whatever that case is. So there's lots of pieces that are needed to make one of these operations work, and there can be help from a wide variety of agencies, not only from the local, which we hope to build, but then if you need additional resources from your county, state, federal, and on up, what that looks like. The scope, you know, we wanted to kind of give you, kind of define it a little bit, because, you know, disasters are different all across the spectrum, whether it's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster that we sometimes deal with as well. So we wanted to kind of, you know, bring that in a little bit. The biggest thing that you'll see as we go down and identifying these is kind of resource typing. And the sizes of the shelters, and we focused on 3 main sizes. Very large shelters at 500 animal capacity as a type 1. Type 2 would be a little bit smaller at 300, and then a type 1 would be 100 animals. And you'll see, we'll talk about that throughout the presentation of how that changes resources. Not only the amount of resources you need, but the experience needed to run an operation like that. And in each one of these is looking at it from the viewpoint of a 7-day operation. Obviously, if this continues, you would just you know, extend out you know, any of the consumable supplies that you would need to keep repeating that for the longevity of an operation. We're not trying to scare people into thinking of a 500 animal shelter for a month long. But you know, it is something to think about as you're building that conversation on what your community can do. As you start off small and finding out what you can do, but with the idea of what happens if things go bigger, how do you build off of that? And that's where these different types help you look at it step by step, or when you might need to call in additional resources. Next slide. So the intended audience, it's a wide scope here, anywhere from the national level, state, regional, local VOADs, federal, state, tribal, and local agencies with pet sheltering responsibilities in the event of disasters. So something you'll hear us talk about is that the agency having authority. That's key for, especially for Diane and myself and our individual agencies, including NARS, of making sure that whoever is requesting us actually has the authority to request animal resources. So it might be citizens see that there's a need, but we need to have that local authority that actually brings us in to make sure that they might already have the resource and are working on it, and the local community isn't aware of it, or they might have additional resources within the state. That's kind of where that self-deploying conversation comes in again, to make sure we're not coming in before any of the local resources are being utilized, and respecting that local jurisdiction. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. I think you're on mute, Diane.
It's one of the problems when you have crazy animals and they bark, so you just mute yourself so you don't hear all the barking in the background. One of the things that I was going to add to that is that making sure that these jurisdictions understand that they need to be connected to their emergency management and be looped into the emergency operations center. Not all of the jurisdictions, because I mean, sometimes the disaster plan set up is that the animal groups are going to do it. So animal control is going to do this. And I've gone into trainings where I've, you know, seen deer in the headlight from the animal control officers because they just found out that they're the disaster plan. So making sure that whoever is involved in this understands to be part of that system. And so that preferably when the invite comes in, it's coming in at a higher level, giving us the jurisdiction or to work in whatever area is in need. But if we're invited in at a city or county level, then we are bound to work within that city county jurisdiction and can't go to any other areas to be able to work. So.
Very good point. So just to make sure folks are kind of on the same page of as we're going through this, some basic definitions. Capability defined as the ability to deliver a service with the kinds of available resources. Our goal is to help build that capability. So the level of service that can be delivered with quantities of available resources. That's where if you're overwhelmed, you need to call in additional resources through the different levels, whether your county or state might have it, or it needs to go larger, either national or non-governmental. The National Incident Management System, or NIMS, defines resources as personnel, equipment, teams, supplies, and facilities available or potentially available for assignment to incident operations for which status is maintained. So you see that resource starts off as a very simple thing, but it really encompasses everything that's needed for an operation. And we'll continue to talk about that. Next slide.
So these definitions for the sheltering. So there are a couple different types. There's there are two types that are defined in this document. The one is a co-located shelter. This is where it's near where the human shelter is. So if the Red Cross has set up a shelter and is taking care of those the people, the animals are going to be in a facility next door, or right nearby. Likely not in the same building unless there's a different airflow and there's the capabilities to be able to do that safely, to take care of the humans as well as the animals. And those co-located shelters generally are taken care of. This is where this document helps. This is going to be taken care of by the animal groups, so the trained folks who can assist with that. The owners may be taking care of it. It depends on the guidelines of the operation, and if they're asking the owners to take care of it, or in some cases requiring the owners to take care of the animals. So that helps with, certainly eventually helps with the staffing of the ongoing care of those animals. The other type is cohabitation. I kind of panicked years ago when North Carolina was talking that that's what their shelter was going to be. It was cohabitated. So you were going to have people and animals in the same space. And I'm picturing these huge congregate shelterings with a crate next to it and thousands of people and barking dogs and terrified cats. And but what's emerging with the cohab shelter is, looking at a space where the people and the animals can be living in a space together. So with that, and it's being done successfully in locations where you have they have their individual areas. They're with their animal. It's better for the animals, again, that human animal bond. It's better for the animals and the people to be able to work in that environment if you have a sheltering location where it can be done well, where the people and the animals can be safe with each other and together, and then the animals are in the care of the people. Josh, do you want to throw anything into either of those before I move on to open?
Yeah, so much like Diane just mentioned about when you first hear cohabitated shelter, it's kind of, especially somebody that's in an industry, whether animal specific or human specific, it can be a scary phrase because it's not the operations that we're used to seeing. One of the things with cohab is where we usually see them is on spontaneous shelters. So a local church or community group decides to bring people in because of a disaster. Well, the people start coming in with pets because people have pets, and they say, well, we'll just make it work. And you'd be surprised to see how often they make it work, because it's natural. It's how we naturally interact with our animals at home, where we're used to being around our animals are used to being around us, and it's an environment we're more comfortable with. Another thing about it, and is it's multiple times a cohabitation shelter that has been set up has been defined in a couple different ways. One is quiet, and anybody who's been around an animal shelter would know quiet is usually not a word that you define a shelter as. So if you can get animals to be quiet, that's amazing. It reduces the stress on the animals. It also reduces the stress on the people. So that right there, to see that time and time again, that is a way that shelter is described as quiet, and it kind of falls in a natural order because it's the way we're used to being around our animals. It just individual agencies, animal agencies, and human sheltering agencies. It's not the normal way that we see things, so we just need to become familiar with it to figure out how we can make our plans to work around it or with it.
So the other type of shelter that we chose to add, and you can see it's not as bright because we wanted to be clear, it's not defined in the document, and it's not that combination human is the open shelter. And why we wanted to bring this in and just mention it was in the age of COVID. So with the current pandemic, in looking at obviously a cohab where there are people have the spacing, and I know the Red Cross has worked on, you know, how they can do a congregate sheltering safely with those options. But other options certainly can be looking at this open shelter, that if you're going to be rescuing and potentially have, you know, hundreds or thousands of animals that need to be rescued from a large scale hurricane, then this is where the animals would go. And so this is in the care of the animal jurisdictions. So it would be the local jurisdiction, likely supported by at least one of the national organizations, if not multiple, potentially state. Sorry about that. Potentially state and regional resources as well in community animal response teams or state animal response teams. So these are going to be the rescued animals. They're going to be owner surrenders or give ups. All of the animals will come into this facility, and then through there they'll try to be reunited with their people. And those animals that have people already known and attached to them may also be in this facility as well, but it's not always the first group that we go to is going to be for the rescue and reunification. Next slide.
It's real quick. It's common for a local jurisdiction to potentially have multiple shelters. One specifically for the owned animals that can work in the either co-location or cohabitation model, and then another one that are more on the legal hold sides or the unknown that need to find the animals, such as Di just mentioned on the open shelter. So, you know, a lot of times when you're associating with some sort of human shelter component, then any animals associated with that should be an owned animal and already have a defined owner. But there's always those unknowns, animals that are rescued that you have to figure out what the owner status is. And being able to separate those helps out on many different operational levels of what's needed. As well as any diseases as well. Generally, our owned animals have seen the veterinarian, are up to date on vaccines, or at least we know that history, where those unknown animals, that question mark there can cause a lot of concern of potentially bringing in diseases that we would prefer not to bring in and expose other animals to if we can.
And potentially people for the zoonotic diseases that could expose people. So next slide. So additionally, there's some talk of the facilities, and one of the things noted is that, you know, the churches and schools are not always the good candidates for the animal shelter. A lot of times you'll have that the people with animals or the animals alone are going to be the last ones really coming out of shelters. So these could be really long-term events, particularly if you're looking at animals that have not found their people yet. So you have these unowned animals that are waiting to be found, and if not ever claimed, then will be moved on to other adoption agencies through the jurisdiction. So looking at facilities, and although these are also some of the first facilities that are set up, and depending on the time of year or the facility itself, they may be able to accommodate. But going into the planning process, knowing how long these facilities are going to be able to be operational, and having sites that you can, if that's where you initially start, that you can move to for the longer term. But they're a great first start, but the longer term is what you also need to be considering. This picture you see was a facility we were asked to set up by the state of Georgia, shelter for a hurricane coming into Georgia a few years back, and we were asked to set up for capacity of 500 to 1,000 animals. The main concern with this was that, you know, these animals initially were coastal humane societies and rescues that needed to move their animals to safe housing that couldn't be moved out for adoption, but could come into this facility for safe housing. It also became a facility where we had folks with owned animals that needed a layover for a little while. And so this was a warehouse. It was a Home Depot that was vacant. And so we had a lot of space and all the amenities that we needed to set up a large scale operation, which thankfully didn't turn out to be 500 to 1,000 animals. So next slide. So the document will go into looking at the spacing that you're going to need and considerations for that. So for the co-located shelter, you see here that it defines that if there are 500 animals in a co-located shelter, then 75 to 100 square feet per animal. And a cohab, you can see there's less space because you have the people and the animals with each other. So 50 to 75. No, sorry, per person animal. So if you have additional people and animals, then additional spacing is going to be needed to do that. In the shelters, it also mentions that the segregation, if you can have areas where you can separate the cats and dogs. In the cohab, as Josh was talking about, where it was quiet, those environments are going to be less stressful for the cats and the dogs in that environment if they can stay quiet and it stays calm. But a lot of chaos for the cats is going to be extra stressful, knowing the dogs that are there barking, and also the risk for the owners in making sure that the cat area is secure. So if a cat would escape from the crate, it's contained in a space and not running amok in a shelter full of dogs and people. And then there is another section that talks about the supplies for livestock. So looking at the requirements for your horses, your other pets. Right now, companion animal as defined in the Pets Act isn't necessarily how people define it. So we're seeing a lot of companion animals that are sheep and goats and pigs. And so wanting to have chickens, did I mention chickens? Lots of chickens. And so you want to have an idea of what is in your community, what that makeup is going to be, and what kind of animals you are likely going to need to provide housing, safe housing for. Josh, nothing?
Yeah, and especially on the livestock piece, this is usually a great point where partnerships can come in. A lot of different agencies are tasked with different species and have the different capability, but it's not uncommon that either livestock or exotics, the small pocket pets, might not have the experience or resources for them, but finding agency partners to be able to help cover that. So the shelter location that you might have for your companion animals might not be very conducive for livestock, but having partnerships with other agencies, you know, at the local fairgrounds or a arena or someplace like that has the ability or you know, the experience, the ability and resources to safely house and shelter those types of animals would be a great partnership. You know, it would still be overseen by that local jurisdiction, with the help of that partner to offer that resource to the community.
And being able to house them individually for both your companion animals and your large animals. I'm a horse person. Horses are incredibly food aggressive, and so running off other horses in an area where they're all being joint fed can result in injury. But we also want to make sure that animals that have never been housed together are not introduced to each other. And then the understanding, because people will be like, well, you know, my dogs always live together. Well, my 4 dogs live together too, and my 2 cats, but I don't want them all together in the same enclosure because, right, you know, if they're in 1,000 square foot house and live together, that's a whole lot different than being in an extra large wire crate together.
Yep.
Next slide. So some more with the ratios and looking at the number of people that are going to be needed. And all of this, you know, it gives you some guidelines, but the other thing that I would throw in is some of this is depending on certain factors, like how trained are the people who are taking care of these animals, and, you know, what's their level of experience, what's their capability. The less training they have, the less they're able to do, you know, get down on their hands and knees on concrete and clean pens, and also the more stressed out and reactive the animals are, the more people that you're going to need to take care of them. So at least in the beginning, we often see that having more people in the beginning is really helpful. But you know, minimums here, and as the event goes on, that these are some numbers as your considerations for minimum numbers to safely be able to take care of things. Next slide.
So the resource typing teams. So this is the personnel piece of this supplies document. Like many other disciplines, you know, police, fire, search and rescue, whatever that case may be, being able to categorize what is needed, and instead of having to go through a list and define what you need, you can say, I need a type 3 sheltering team, and it'll have kind of what that looks like. And we'll go through this in the next couple of slides. But that's kind of the premise of it, is to try to simplify. When you're asking for resources, I don't have to give you, you know, a 20 item list. I can give you one description that has those 20 items defined. That way you can kind of move on and take care of the other things that you need to get a hold of. The conversations for resource typing is, like I said, it's been done in many different disciplines already. On the animal sides, there's been quite a few different iterations of it. The current one that we're working on that has been accepted by FEMA was originally kind of brought in by SADRA, or the Southern Agriculture and Animal Disaster Response Alliance. They did a tremendous amount of work trying to define what they commonly see the need is during hurricane season and other disasters. NARS looked at that same list and provided our feedback for it. And we really felt that we had a very good starting point to continue that conversation and push that up to the federal level to get some agreement. Now, keeping in mind that, you know, this is an overarching resource typing. If you go down to a local level, they might have other specific needs in their area. But the resource types are meant to be able to cover the country as a whole, and be fairly consistent. So there still might be some tweaking for down to the local agency of what particular disasters might be. But this really does help give us a point to move forward, to define what common needs are, and expectations of those resources would be. And the biggest piece is, you know, that this document is heavy in the supplies aspect of setting up a shelter. It can't be overstated that having the experienced personnel running these operations that understand the animal issues that come up when you shelter unknown animals together, and be able to identify issues before they become giant problems that spread throughout the shelter. So, you know, there, as we go through these, you'll see how we kind of define some of that experience, with the understanding that local agencies might not have this capability yet, but this help gives you a roadmap of what you need to build to. And also, if you need assistance from outside resources, of being able to request those resources and have it understood. Next slide, please. Okay, there we go. So we kind of zoomed in and I highlighted some key points. I actually did these in reverse order. I started with a type 3, which would be a smaller shelter, and then we'll work to that type 1. Hopefully you guys don't have to deal with a type 1, but type 3 would be more realistic of what you might see within your community. And in all honesty, there, in some aspects, there are a type 4 of even smaller. Hopefully that's all that you guys would ever see, if anything. But I've highlighted the capacity of a type 3 shelter, and this is a cohab shelter, with the humans and animals being sheltered together. So the capacity of the shelter is 100 animals, and I highlighted down off on the right side that it is a cohabitated shelter. And then I highlighted some key resource positions. So we start off with a team lead, a shelter manager, animal care and handling specialist, animal intake and reunification specialist, a veterinarian assistant, and then animal shelter equipment kit, animal shelter supply kit are the resources. Each one of those is actually defined further of what that position actually means. So we can share the link to these, not only the ones that are already in the document, but the definitions of these different resources. But as you look over off to the right side, it defines what that resource is. If it's, most of them are personnel, but the bottom two are equipment and the supplies. And then, you know, further on as you go over to the right, it defines the, you know, what level or type each resources is, and then on the very right is the quantity needed of each position. So and that's how each one of these documents is laid out to help flow for it. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see how it changes from a type 3 to a type 2. So now our capacity is for 300 animals, and we're still doing a cohabitated shelter. So the animals and humans are together. And I've highlighted the changes. So on the very right, those resources were the same, just the number of them changed. And then on the very bottom, because there's more animals, the number of supplies you're going to need is going to be increased. So the quantity cache increases on a type 2 versus a type 3 shelter supply kit. So that's kind of the layout and the difference. But you know, if you take away the highlighting and you flip back and forth between a type 3 and a type 2, it'd be hard to see what the difference is. If we go to the next slide, we go to the bigger boy of type 1. And so now we're talking on the top right, we're looking at 500 animals in this shelter still being housed with their owners. But this is a large operation. So if you think of 500 animals, and you know that each one has at least 1 or 2 owners associated with it, you start to get an idea of how big this operation can get, and there'd be a lot more complicated pieces to it. In this aspect of it, if you look over on the needed resources, we've got an administrative support added to it to help organize and kind of keep all that the functions going on within the shelter organized. It not only what the tasks are, but what costs are and everything that goes along with that shelter. Once again, on the far right, you see that the quantities continue to change, originally from our type 3 and our type 2 shelter, as well as the supplies, because we're going to need more crates, we're going to need more bowls, we're going to need all that stuff that goes with it. It increases, and that's defined as in the type 1 supply kit of what those increases look like. If we go to the next slide. So now we're back to a type 3, but we're at a co-location shelter. It's defined on the very top of the title of the slide of the CL. It gets to be very confusing. That's why I highlighted down on the right side, underneath the capacity and number, that it is actually a co-located shelter. So this is the shelter where the humans are being sheltered in one room or piece of the shelter, and then the animals are in a separate shelter but in close proximity that the owners can come over and provide that care. So the difference between a type 3 shelter, a co-located shelter, as to a type 3 cohabitated shelter, we've added on the resource side another animal care and control specialist, not just the number of them, but a different type of them. So a type 2 is a lower experience that can help the type 1 animal care and control. So that's kind of what you'll see in that there's a little bit different complication in interacting with the animals, a little bit more hands-on in a co-located shelter versus a cohabitated shelter where the owners are providing all the care. So that's where the additional animal care and handling specialist would come in to help provide that. The onus is still that the owner would be providing care, but we understand since the locations, there's a little bit of separation, that there's going to need to be additional animal experience and handling there to help with any issues that could come up. If we go to the next slide.
I think one thing too, no, you're fine. One thing too is that as the operation goes on and you start moving towards the recovery phase of the response, that, those humans, people, the people are going to need to start getting back to their everyday lives, and so part of that recovery effort is it may take them away from the ability to care for their animals on the schedule that has, if there's a schedule that's been set for that. So there's considerations for the co-located shelter that, we're there to assist these people, helping them during the response phase, and then, enabling them to get to the recovery phase.
And that's a very good point.
And Josh and Diana, I want to remind you that we've got about 20 minutes to go till we're and we do have some questions, so you can take that into consideration.
I appreciate that. All right, Diane, that was a great point too, in understanding as in the planning phase that it's not ideal, but at times operationally for the local agency, operations may need to change from a cohabitation to a co-location or something else based on resources or what the community is actually needing while they try to get their lives back together. So real quickly on this one for the type 2, I just highlighted the changes from type 3 to type 2, just so you can see it. If we go to the next slide, we go up to a type 1. Co-location shelter, once again, very similar. We're still talking capacity of 500. You see the change in the quantity of those resources, and then same thing with the supplies on, obviously we're going to need more stuff. Next slide.
So for the supply kits, it lists at the top of the supply kit defining what the composition of animals is considered for the supplies. And then you'll see the quantities for type 1, type 2, and type 3. I didn't copy that on the document. I'll show you a next phase where you can see that. But with a small kit for the companion animals and that composition, and then the large animal and what that composition is. This is our best guesstimate, and certainly it's not a end-all be-all for what you're going to need for the responses, because you're going to have other animals coming in, and certainly considerations for the communities on what is permissible. So if exotics are permissible in your community, then, you know, certainly understanding the need for that composition or for supplies for those animals potentially, or can you outsource those animals to an expert for that particular species? So next slide. All right, so here you can see a little bit where it defines the resource, what it is that you need, and the number that you would need for each one of the type kit, on what's going to be in that particular kit. So if you're requesting a type 2 kit, getting 60 instead of the 100 in a type 1. So, and the document, next slide. These are the areas that are highlighted in the document, that underneath each one of these categories are the supplies that are included in the kit. And we've tried to spell out everything that you could possibly need to operate a shelter under each one of these categories. And each one of them, again, is broken down by the type, so the quantity for that particular type. So next slide.
So kind of a quick wrap up on it of making sure that, you know, resource is a broad or word that's defined and breaks down to quite a lot of parts. So the key thing here is we want to make sure that the agency having jurisdiction is the one that's actually setting up the operation, and then the pieces that allow an operation to happen. You know, everything's kind of built off of each one of these is extremely important. You take any one of these pieces out and you don't have an operation. But building your operation off of the location, obviously you need the personnel to run it that have the experience of working with animals and animal issues, the supplies to adequately and safely house the animals, and it's all held together by the partnership of the different agencies that come together to solve the problem. Each one of these you can't take out. Not any one agency can solve the problem, and you know, you've got to have a cache of supplies, you've got to have the location to do it as well. One of the biggest issues I've done on a couple different responses is when the local agency can't really decide or lock down a location, and you're constantly having to worry about having to move an operation. That means you can only set it up so far because of having that restriction of potentially having to move an operation. If you can secure the location, and then you can really build and plan off of that. Having backups though, because we know some things get, you know, destroyed or affected during a disaster. So don't put your eggs all in one basket. Having backup plans as well. Next slide. So since we have some questions, the remaining of the presentation were pictures just to kind of show some layouts. If we want to, while we do questions, if you just kind of want to scroll through those, just so we've got a visual representation of some layouts. But let's go ahead and go into questions.
All right, this is thank you. Let me see if I can. Well, first question, because she's a good friend of mine, I'm going to ask her question first. Her name is Sharon Holla, and this is going to be directed for you guys. And she says, have you seen or felt a shift with local emergency management being more welcoming to the pre-planning, training, and support since Katrina?
I'll jump in and take a shot at that one. It really depends on a couple different things. One is how much resources that local emergency management has. If it's a one-person show, they're generally overwhelmed. That doesn't mean they don't care, but a lot of times they're completely overwhelmed, and they might not have time. Now, we've also seen the one-person shows that you know, they do everything they can, and animals are part of that consideration. But we still do go into communities where animals have not even crossed the thinking at all. and we kind of have to start that conversation with it. So it really depends on where you are in the country. It depends on how often they get disasters, because as Di mentioned at the beginning of this, if you're not thinking about animals, it's going to come up in your disaster. And if you're not providing for them, an agency will get destroyed over social media and public outcry that the animals weren't cared for. And if they've experienced that once, it then becomes a priority in the future. But if they haven't, it's not uncommon to still have that attitude that they're not important. Di?
We've seen those discrepancies a lot from the agencies that are really on top of the animal issues during COVID, because there are so many communities that have not been impacted on the scale that everybody has been impacted by COVID, and so we've tried to offer resources for feeding animals and that kind of stuff, and they're just like, that it's not about the animals, it's about the people. So but is it better? Yeah, I think overall it's a lot better.
Yeah.
So is from another question from Tiffany Deneau, is there a master CART, C-A-R-T directory maintained by Humane or other organizations? And is there any centralized resource agency list for by counties to help create VOADs?
I'll jump in on that one too. So ASPCA actually did a really good survey, a couple different surveys about the national capacity and trying to see which states and then down to counties have CARTs or animal response teams. So they've got tremendous data on what they found. There is not a centralized location of states and or county CARTs. Each agency kind of has the ones that they work with and kind of go from there. But with, what is it, close to 6,000 counties nationwide. Each one,
3,
a lot of them
3,100.
3,100, sorry. Each one home ruled. I mean, you'd have to have individual contacts for each one of those, and you can see how that would be a problem trying to have that information.
Great. We've had some multiple questions about getting a copy of the presentation. Without objection, Diane and Josh, I think we'll get a PDF version and we can put it on the National Mass Care Strategy website. Is that good for everybody?
Yep.
Yeah, and I believe this is being recorded, so you can follow up on it again on the National Hurricane Conference website.
Yes. So so we'll make that and then there is from I have to get my reading glasses out here. It's from Laura Bevan. Her question is, one of the issues that our long-term pet-friendly shelter plan is that our volunteers are older, and in the age of COVID, this is an issue. We've had over 300 pets and people during Florida hurricane evacuations.
Yeah, so there is work being done on how to shelter in the age of COVID. And certainly the population that are likely to be the volunteers and assist with that are the higher risk population. And this is where I think looking at other alternatives, I know can people be put up in hotels? Certainly not at the large scale that we're looking at with hurricane evacuations and those kind of numbers. But are those an option? And the other is options for cohabitation, that the owners are going to be responsible for taking care of their own animals. And then the other is partnerships. You got to build relationships that you have mutual aid agreements that you can bring in folks to support with that. I mean, and we all see it. I mean, a lot of our volunteers do tend to be older, retired, and I mean, let me tell you, they're workhorses. We could not do what we do without them, but we definitely have to take care of them in the age of COVID. So we're going to have to look at other resources, and Cohab is a really good option.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we lean towards Cohab. And just for, especially for the state agencies today, there's a NASEP call, the National Alliance of State Animal and Agriculture Emergency Programs. And NARS has a sheltering task force that is specifically looking at that question of what local agencies need to think about sheltering this year during COVID-19. So that call is this afternoon at 3 o'clock Eastern. And that call will also be recorded, so don't worry if you can't make that today or don't have the call-in information. But if you go to the nasep.org, they'll post that recorded call within the next couple of weeks, so you'll have access to that to know where some additional resources are, and kind of to help local communities deal with that shortfall that even the national agencies are seeing with our volunteers as well.
Great. Now another question from Tiffany about does California have an emergency support function 11 or that deals with pets and livestock? And I know that every state is different. I was the mass care coordinator for Florida for 15 years, and in the state of Florida we had a emergency support function 17 that was for pets and animals. And a lot of the answers to I do not know the answer for California, but I will say that most of the states they have a state emergency comprehensive emergency management plan in which they allocate the responsibility for that. Do either one of y'all know what the situation is in California about? Do they have an emergency support function?
They do. I think it's 11. I'm not positive about what it is, but yeah, they definitely, California does some really good things for animals. So I know they have an emergency support function. Josh, do you know the number?
I believe it is 11, but much like Michael said, too, other states, they define it differently. Sometimes it falls under 6A for mass care, that at least the sheltering component of it, any field work potentially, or agriculture falls under 11 a lot of times. Or in some of the southern states, they do have a 17, which isn't common throughout the country, but you see Florida, South Carolina as an example that have those. I'm pretty sure it's 11 for California, though.
I think so.
So Emmanuel Maciel talks about how can we get copies of the resource typing protocol. The resource typing documents are they're available. There's a catalog that FEMA maintains. If you just Google FEMA and resource typing, you can get I don't remember it off the top of my head, but you can get in there, and it's got all of these type 1, 2, and 3, the resource typing teams that were the basis for the document. We took the resource typing teams that were FEMA had already been developed by the pet and animal community, and we based those on, and then we simply added on the supply and equipment kits that based on the size of the size of the shelters and the typing for those shelters came from this emergency management from the FEMA resource typing document. Tiffany also brought up the fact that that's very interesting in the congregate sheltering environment now. The square footage has gone up to maintain the social distancing. It's gone up to 110 square feet per person. So there's a lot of reference information on the National Mass Care Strategy website, and I would encourage you guys to So I'm going real quick to look and see if I've got some more. You got any more? Okay, here's one from Scott. He says, has there been liability concerns when the local governments take over the acceptance and care of the pets? And before you answer, Sharon Holloway answers that California's the SF11 is the one that's responsible. Thank you, Sharon. Go ahead. Liability concerns.
Yeah, there's plenty of liability between the different sheltering setups, whether it's co-location, cohabitation, or an open shelter. So the more work that an agency does for the animal, the more liability that's either a part of it or you outline in a shelter waiver that the owner signs outlining the care for that animal, including emergency care if the animal happens to get sick and we can't contact the owner. And that's kind of what most agencies utilize to help minimize the liability by explaining to the owner of what care is provided. But ultimately the owner is the one that's responsible for their pet. But yeah, it varies on how much involvement a local agency does in that care.
Diane, anything to add? No.
I would just say
No.
that extends to the intake as well of the animals for vaccinations that are required upon intake or for intake, and so those are part of the documentation. The other liability I would throw out some thoughts around is that we've seen an increase of animals that are being defined as service animals, or that are not officially, like, legally service animals. Recently here again, I'm in Georgia. Recently in Georgia, there was a storm where people were being evacuated, and the people showed up with their 2 dogs that they said were service animals, and they needed to be with them. And then the one dog actually bit the animal control officer. These were not service animals; they were actually human aggressive animals, and not safe to go into a shelter with other people and children and everything else. So those are some other things that you're going to need to consider.
Great, super. We're about time to get finished here. I wanted to bring up the last slide, the National Mass Care Strategy website again. So that, as I said, the document is going to the National VOAD Board for approval, and then once we get it, they approve it, and we're going to put it up on the website. There's a national NMCS, National Mass Care Strategy at redcross.org is the email rather for the National Mass Care Strategy website. So if you were to and here's the nationalmasscarestrategy.org is the location of the website. What we're looking for is if you have comments or questions, once the documents come out, we would like to get feedback, and we're going to use the mechanism for getting this feedback is going to be this Red Cross National Mass Care Strategy. Any got 2 minutes? Anything final comments, Diane, Joss?
Nothing from me.
Good. Great.
Yeah, I would just recommend any feedback to make sure you reach out to the National Mass Care Strategy. That way we can just kind of, try to figure out how to make the document even better, or what's the next steps that you guys feel is needed. I do want to plug the NACEP call again on COVID issues, sheltering in a disaster, as well, for a resource that will be available down the road. And just thank you guys for having us.
Great. All right. So we're dropping off. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.